I am sitting in the dark cabin of a houseboat that still smells faintly of sunscreen, stale coffee, and old river water. I keep my face away from the windows out of habit, even though I covered every inch of glass days ago. It is mid-afternoon by my watch, but inside here it could be midnight. That is the point. No glow, no silhouette, no movement anyone can read from shore. The water outside is calm enough that the hull barely creaks. Calm water is not safe water. Calm water carries sound. Calm water reflects mistakes. I put my ear near the front hatch and listen. I do not hear engines. I do not hear voices. I do not hear the soft slap of a paddle. I hear gulls arguing somewhere out toward the open channel, and I hear a distant clatter from the marina docks that could be wind, could be something dragging a line, could be a person knocking something over. The infected make noise too, but it is not the movie noise people expect. Most of the time it is shoes scraping and a wet cough, and the dull impact of hands on wood when it gets stuck behind a fence. The loud parts happen when someone panics. The loud parts get people killed. I crawl to the little galley and touch the counter where the sunlight used to land. I taped black contractor bags across the frames first, then blankets over that, then cardboard where it fit, then more tape. It looks ugly. It works. When the sun is high, a thin seam of brightness tries to push in along one edge. I keep a roll of tape right there so I do not have to search with a light. I press another strip down with my thumb until the seam disappears. Every day the heat loosens adhesive. Every night the air turns damp and cold, and it pulls at corners. I stay ahead of it because I cannot afford one night where a passing boat catches a pale rectangle and thinks, somebody is in there. This boat was not mine a week ago. A week ago I had an apartment, a job, and a routine that felt permanent. Then the emergency alerts went from warnings to instructions, and the instructions got ignored, and the streets turned into a place you could not cross without seeing someone sprint past with a shopping cart or a suitcase, screaming at nobody. The first videos were shaky and unbelievable. The second day, nobody laughed. By the third day, the only sound in my building was doors slamming and footsteps running down stairwells and someone pounding on a neighbor's door until it stopped. I waited too long. I am not proud of that. I can still name the exact hour I finally stood up from the couch and started moving. I came to the marina because I ran out of options that did not involve the highway. The highway meant stalled traffic, crowds, and the kind of noise that pulls infected from blocks away. The marina meant water, and water meant space. People forget that water has edges. Every shoreline turns into a funnel. Every dock becomes a hallway. Boats become traps if you cannot leave quietly. I knew all that, and I still came here because my legs could carry me here without stepping into the biggest chaos. I brought a backpack, a kitchen knife, a lighter, 2 bottles of water, a rain jacket, and a dead phone. I brought nothing that matters now except the habit of staying calm when the plan changes. On the first night at the marina, I did not choose a boat. I hid behind a stack of old dock floats and listened to the whole place settle into darkness. Lights flickered on across the water as people on boats tried to keep their routines. You could see it in the soft, warm rectangles on decks. People cooking, people talking, people pretending it was a storm outage. 2 hours later, I heard a scream cut off mid-word, and then a splash, then another scream farther down the docks, then a chorus of banging and shouting that rolled through the slips and bounced back off the warehouses. A minute after that, I heard engines crank, one after another, and I heard hulls scraping pilings. The marina turned into a cage full of animals slamming into bars. I stayed tucked behind those floats until the engines thinned out, and the shouting turned into scattered noise. Then I moved. I moved on hands and knees down the dock so my shoes would not scuff. I kept low because moonlight can draw an outline off water the way it draws an outline off snow. I did not have a flashlight. I did not want one. I used the glow from the city to see enough. Boats rocked in their slips with lines snapping tight and going slack. A few were still lit up inside, curtains open, television lights strobing across the water. Those boats felt haunted even before you looked close. This houseboat sat at the far end, away from the main walkway, tucked behind a line of larger cabin cruisers. It was not fancy. It was built to be lived on, not shown off. The deck rail was scratched. The roof had patches. The name on the stern was sun-faded and chipped. What caught my attention was that it had no lights on, no movement behind the windows, and the door was shut, but not locked. That last part mattered, because locked doors meant somebody was still thinking about property. An unlocked door meant somebody left in a hurry or somebody never came back from the dock. I waited. I stood on the dock for a full minute and did not move. That is a hard minute to spend when you want to rush. The marina air smelled of algae, fuel, and hot plastic from melted dock boxes. I listened for breathing inside the boat. I listened for shifting weight. I listened for the soft tapping the infected make when it hits something it does not understand. Nothing. I stepped across the gap, kept my weight light, and pulled the door open an inch. The hinges barely squeaked. I closed it again and waited another count of 10. Still nothing. Then I went in. The inside was cluttered with normal life. A throw blanket on the couch, a pair of flip-flops under a chair, a paperback on the table, bookmarks still in it, a coffee mug with a ring of dried foam at the bottom. On the counter, a bowl of oranges that had started to soften. In the back, a bedroom with the bed made and a jacket hanging on a hook. I walked through slow, knife in my hand, and checked every corner and every closet. I checked the bathroom. I checked the little engine compartment hatch. I checked under the bed. I found nobody. That did not make me feel safe. It made me feel responsible for whatever happened to the person who left. I did not turn on a single light. I did not open curtains. I did not even look through the windows. I moved by touch, learning the layout. When my fingers found a drawer with spare batteries, I put them in my pocket without thinking. When I found a first aid kit, I set it on the table in the same spot I could find again in the dark. When I found a small propane stove and 2 spare canisters, I set them beside the sink. When I found a handheld marine radio that was dead, I did not waste time on it. Dead electronics were everywhere now. Working power was a rumor. My first job was the windows. The houseboat had big windows because it was meant to be bright and open. Bright and open gets you spotted. I found tape in a drawer. I found trash bags under the sink. I found a stash of old moving blankets in a rear storage locker. I worked with the door shut, moving slow, making sure no one on the dock saw the shadows of my arms through the glass. I taped the trash bags up first, then pushed blankets into place, then taped again. I did not do it neat. I did it fast and complete. By dawn, the inside was blacked out enough that even if someone stood on the dock and looked straight in, he would see nothing but darkness. Then I sat on the floor and ate an orange with my back against the wall. I did not enjoy it. I ate because I knew what comes after you stop eating. I drank water in small sips and put the bottle down and forced myself not to take another. The infected outside did not matter if I ran out of water inside. The second job was water. I found 2 empty plastic jugs in a cabinet and a collapsible bucket. I found a tarp folded on the roof deck. The boat had rain streaks on the sides, so I knew it had been sitting long enough to get weathered. That meant rain would come again. I could catch it. I could store it. I could boil it. It would keep me alive without going to shore. By the time the sun came up, the marina was a different place. The loud engine chaos was gone. The docks were almost still. A few boats had drifted into odd angles and knocked against neighbors, bumping softly. I heard a phone ring somewhere and ring again and again until it stopped. I heard a dog barking, frantic, then quiet. Across the slips, I saw a man on a sailboat deck, standing stiff, looking at the dock. He did not move for a long time. When he finally turned his head, it moved in a slow, wrong way. He stepped forward and hit the rail and kept pressing into it. He did not climb over. He just pushed his face against it and made a sound that got under my skin. I backed away from my covered windows and stayed lower. I learned the first rule of the houseboat that day. Do not give the outside world any reason to notice you exist. That rule has more parts than people think. It is not only lights. It is smell. It is smoke. It is rhythm. Humans notice patterns. Humans notice when something looks cared for. If the deck looks swept, someone knows a person is there. If the lines look adjusted, someone knows a person is there. If you cook at the same time each day, the scent carries, and someone can time it. The infected do not plan. People do. People are the ones who circle. I stayed inside all day, and only moved when the wind rose enough to cover small sounds. I dug through lockers for anything useful. I found fishing gear. Not great gear, but enough. A couple of rods, a tackle box, a net with a tear in it, and a bucket of sinkers. I found a small inflatable dinghy strapped under the stern deck, plus a hand pump. That was a lifesaver and a problem. Inflating it made noise. Using it wrong could put me in the water. I left it where it was and made a note in my head to use it only if I had to. I found extra dock lines, fenders, and a spare anchor. I found a toolbox with basic stuff, the kind of stuff a person buys and never uses. I would use it. That night I did not sleep. I sat on the floor with my back to the couch, knife in my lap, and listened to the marina settle. Once an hour I crawled to the hatch and listened again. The man on the sailboat kept making that sound. Another sound started around midnight, a slow bumping from somewhere behind the dock, a hull hitting a piling in a steady pattern. It went on for hours. You start to understand how a person can go mad from small, repetitive sounds when there is nowhere to go and no way to fix the thing making it. I forced myself to stay still and not react. Motion draws attention. Motion also makes you tired. Tired people make mistakes. Day 2, the wind brought rain. I went to the roof deck before sunrise, moving slow, keeping low, and laid the tarp out at an angle so water would run into the bucket. I used a couple of bungee cords to keep it from flapping. Flapping tarp is a beacon. The rain started light, then turned into a steady sheet. It sounded loud on the roof. Loud rain is a gift. Loud rain lets you work. I moved a few things on the deck to block any line of sight from the main marina lane, then went back down and shut the hatch. When I checked the bucket an hour later, it had enough water to make me stop thinking about dying of thirst for a while. That is a powerful feeling. It does not last. I poured the water through a clean t-shirt into one of the jugs. I did not trust anything floating in it. Rain catches whatever is on your roof. Bird droppings, dust, old leaf bits. I boiled a pot on the propane stove with the windows covered and the vent barely cracked. I hated cracking it. Any gap is a risk. Steam is a risk. Smell is a risk. I waited until the rain got heavier, then boiled. When it cooled, I poured it into another jug and put it under the bed where it would stay dark and cool. I made myself a rule: always keep 2 days of water minimum. If I can never go below that, I have time to think when something goes wrong. The third day, I fished for the first time. I did it from the back deck, with the rod tip kept low so it would not silhouette. I did not cast far. Casting is a motion people notice. I dropped the line straight down near the weeds that grew under the dock edge. Fishing in a marina is not clean, but fish do not care about clean. Fish care about food, and the marina has plenty of scraps. I waited with my hand resting on the rod, eyes on the water surface, ears open. When I felt a tug, I pulled up slowly. A small fish, silver, thrashing. I used a towel to keep it from making noise on the deck, then killed it quick. No drama, no mess. I cleaned it in a bucket and threw the waste out into deep water away from the slip. Waste draws gulls. Gulls draw eyes. Eating fish without making the boat smell strong is a balancing act. I cooked it with the stove on low, lid on the pan. Vent cracked just enough. I ate it plain. No spices, no fancy. Food becomes fuel when you do not know where your next meal comes from. I washed the pan immediately and wiped every surface. I took the fish remains and sealed them in a plastic bag, then put the bag in a cooler that still had a few half-melted ice packs. The cooler would not stay cold long, but it could keep smell down for a bit. Every job I did had the same goal: keep the houseboat from becoming a signal. By the end of the first week, I stopped thinking of the houseboat as a boat and started thinking of it as a dark box floating in a giant mirror. The mirror showed anyone who looked at it what he wanted to see. Some people saw nothing and passed by. Some people saw a target. I watched from behind my covered windows through a pinhole I made behind a curtain seam. It was barely big enough to see out, but it let me check the dock without exposing a square of light. Through that pinhole, I saw the marina change. The boats that had left on the first night were gone, and the slips where they were tied looked abandoned. The boats that stayed started to look wrong. Some were empty, with doors open, bumping in the wind. Some had people on them that moved in that slow, broken way. A couple had both. One afternoon, I saw a small runabout drift in from the channel with nobody at the wheel. It bumped into the end of the dock and bounced off, then drifted again. It had a bright red cooler in the bow. It had a life jacket hanging off the side. It had a rope trailing in the water. I watched it for a long time. A red cooler could be food. A red cooler could be bait. I stayed still. I told myself the truth. The moment I step onto a dock in daylight, someone might see me from shore or from another boat. The moment I paddle out to intercept, I make a wake. The moment I bring that runabout close, I risk noise, I risk movement, I risk attention. I let it drift past and disappear around the corner of the marina. That was the day I started to understand how hunger can make you stupid. I did not let it. On day 9, I heard the first circling. Not infected, not the wind, not random drift. A motor, low and steady, coming down the channel. I listened for it before I looked, because looking makes you commit. The sound stopped near the main marina entrance, then started again, closer, slow, careful. I moved to my pinhole and watched. A small fishing boat, maybe 18 feet, with 2 men in it. Both wore hats. Both had long sleeves, even in the heat. Both sat low and scanned. The boat moved past the first row of slips and paused, then eased forward, then paused again. The men were not lost, they were hunting. They did not tie up. They did not call out. They kept the motor running in short bursts, then let the boat glide. One man pointed at a cabin cruiser with an open hatch. The other nodded. They drifted close, and one leaned over with something in his hand, maybe a boat hook, and nudged the hull. He listened. No response. He stepped onto the cruiser and disappeared inside. He came back out with a backpack and a jug of water. He tossed both into his boat and stepped back without hesitation. That was not his first stop. He had a system. He was stripping boats. I held still and watched them get closer to my row. The houseboat sat deeper in the slip than most boats, its side partly shielded by a neighbor. That neighbor had a torn cover flapping in the breeze. I hated that cover, but in that moment I loved it because it broke up sight lines. The men drifted by, slow, eyes on windows. One man stared at my covered glass longer than I wanted. He leaned forward and squinted. I did not move. I did not blink. I did not shift weight. The man turned away, and the boat continued. They moved on to another boat, boarded it, came back with more stuff, and then left the marina the same slow way they entered. After they were gone, I sat on the floor for a long time and replayed every detail. Those men were not desperate. Desperate people rush. Those men were organized. Organized people come back. Organized people tell friends. Organized people start circling the places that paid off. My houseboat looked sealed and quiet, which could read as abandoned, or could read as someone hiding. The blackout job mattered now more than ever. If one corner peeled and a thin blade of daylight leaked out, a man with binoculars could see it. If I cooked fish at the wrong time and the scent carried out across still water, a man could follow it. If I ran the engine longer than a minute, a man could triangulate sound and guess my position even without seeing me. That night, I changed my rules. I stopped using the propane stove at night. I stopped opening the roof hatch unless rain was loud or wind was up. I started packing my supplies into 2 bags, one that stayed ready by the rear door and one by the front hatch. If someone boarded, I needed a way out that did not involve fighting in a narrow hallway. This is the part people do not like to talk about when they imagine survival. Boats are tight. Boats are corners. Boats are places where one person blocks a doorway and you have nowhere to go. You do not win a fight in a boat. You avoid it. On day 12, I made my first move away from the marina. I did it because staying put creates a pattern, and patterns get noticed. I waited until after midnight when the moon was down and the wind picked up enough to rough the water surface. Rough water swallows small sounds and breaks reflections. I went to the engine compartment and checked everything by touch. I knew nothing about engines before all this, but I knew enough now to respect them. The motor would start loud if it did not start clean. Loud start equals attention. I opened the fuel vent, checked the battery switch, checked the throttle position. I was slow and careful. I did not want the motor to cough. I untied the lines without letting them slap. I wrapped each one around a cleat and laid it down soft. I pulled the fenders in so they would not squeak against the dock. I pushed off with a boat hook, using steady pressure instead of a shove. Then I started the engine. It caught fast, a low rumble that felt too big in the quiet. I kept it in neutral for 3 seconds, then eased into forward at the lowest speed the boat would hold. I did not use any lights. The world outside was dim and gray, shaped by starlight and the glow of a city that was still burning in places. I guided the houseboat out of the slip and down the channel, staying in the shadow of larger boats. The engine sound carried. I could tell because I heard a response from somewhere on the dock, a soft banging, then another, then a guttural moan that rose and fell. Something heard me. Something always hears you. I kept the run short, under 2 minutes, just enough to clear the marina and drift into the wider river where the current could carry me. When I killed the engine, the quiet hit hard. The houseboat kept moving, sliding on momentum. I steered with small rudder corrections and let the current do the rest. In that moment, I understood why people used to move contraband at night on rivers. Darkness and current can hide a lot if you keep your head. I drifted into a side channel lined with reeds and low trees. The smell changed from fuel and dock rot to mud and vegetation. I used the pole to feel depth and found a spot where the bottom rose enough to anchor without grounding. I lowered the anchor slow, hand over hand, chain laid down soft. I tied off and listened. No engines, no voices. Just insects and water and distant city noise that sounded smaller out here. I moved back inside and sat with my back against the wall again. I did not feel safe. I felt less visible. That is different. The next morning, I watched the main channel through my pinhole and saw boats moving. Not many, but enough to prove people were still out there. A larger boat passed, slow, with 3 people on it. One stood at the bow with binoculars. One sat at the helm. One held a long object across his knees that I did not need to identify. They scanned the shoreline, the reeds, the marina entrance. They were looking for smoke, looking for movement, looking for anything that meant supplies. I sank lower and held still until they passed. I stayed still long after they were gone because sometimes boats loop back. That is what circling looks like. Life settled into a routine, but it was not a comfortable routine. It was a routine built from small tasks that kept me alive and kept me unseen. Every morning I checked my lines by touch. I checked the anchor tie-off for chafe. I checked the tarp on the roof for tears. I checked the water jugs. I checked for leaks under the sink and around the windows. Boats take on water in ways you do not notice until it matters. Every afternoon I fished, sometimes with a rod, sometimes with a simple hand line I made from spare cord because hand line is quieter. I cleaned fish inside a bucket, wiped down surfaces, controlled smell. Every night I sat in darkness and listened. Listening became work. The infected showed up on the shoreline a few days after I moved. I saw one first, stumbling along the mud bank, clothes soaked and heavy, hair stuck to its face. It stopped at the edge of the water and stared across, head tilted, not thinking, just reacting to sound and movement. When a bird splashed nearby, it lurched forward and slipped, then caught itself and stood there again. It did not swim. It waited a step and then stopped, confused by depth. I watched it for a long time. It did not leave. Eventually, it sat down in the mud and stayed there, rocking slightly, hands digging into the wet ground. The sight of it made my skin feel tight, so I kept myself busy scrubbing a pan I had already scrubbed. Work keeps you from freezing in place. More of them came over the next week. Not a horde, not a flood. Just singles and pairs wandering the shoreline. They did not know I was there. That was the goal. The boat sat out from shore far enough that even if one waded out, it would lose interest before reaching the hull. The real risk was noise. If I dropped something metal on deck and it rang, heads would turn. If a pot clanged, heads would turn. If the engine started, heads would turn. It did not matter if they could reach me. It mattered that they could gather. Gathered infected attract people. People hear them and think, something is there. One night, around 2 a.m, something bumped the hull hard enough that the whole boat shuddered. I froze. I did not jump up. I did not rush. I listened. Another bump, softer. Then a scraping sound along the side. I moved to the pinhole. The water surface outside had a faint sheen from starlight, broken by small waves. Something floated against my hull, pressed by current. A log maybe, a piece of dock, a body. I could not tell. I watched it drift along and catch on the stern corner. It bumped again, a dull thud. The sound traveled across the water. Across the channel, one of the infected on the bank lifted its head. It stood. It started walking toward the sound, slow but purposeful. I stayed still and waited, watching the thing along my hull keep scraping. I needed it gone without making a bigger noise. I took the boat hook and moved to the rear door, opening it an inch. Cold, damp air slid inside. I kept my body behind the door, only the hook reaching out. I pushed at the floating object gently, trying to guide it away. It resisted, then shifted, then slid. When it turned, I saw fabric in the water, dark and heavy. It was a body, face down, bloated, caught on something. I pushed again, harder, and the body rolled enough that a pale arm surfaced, fingers curled. I did not stare. I did not think about who it was. I focused on the problem, noise and attention. I pushed until it drifted free and floated away into deeper water. Then I shut the door slow and latched it. The infected on the bank kept coming anyway. It was too late. It had hurt enough to commit. It waded into the water, step by step, pants filling, arms out. It got to knee depth and stopped, confused by the feel of water pulling. It stood there for a long time. I held my breath without thinking, then forced myself to breathe normal and slow. I stayed off the floorboards that creak. I moved one hand at a time so nothing brushed a wall. The infected waded one more step, then stopped again, then turned its head toward a sound farther down the bank. Something else had moved. It turned and waded back out. Dragging wet clothes, I did not move until it was gone from sight. After that, I sat in the dark and kept my hands busy tightening a knot that did not need tightening. Around day 20, I heard engines again, closer than I wanted, in the side channel. Not the main river, not a distant pass. This was someone coming into the reeds. I killed every habit that could make sound. I did not shift. I did not open the pinhole wider. I watched through my seam and saw a small aluminum boat ease in, using a trolling motor on low. 2 people this time, a man at the stern and a woman in front. Both wore life vests. The man held a paddle ready, using it to push off reeds to keep from scraping. That meant he understood noise discipline. He was not just wandering, he was searching. The boat glided past my bow at maybe 40 yards. The woman looked toward my houseboat and lifted binoculars. I kept still. The sun was behind her, so her face was shadowed. She leaned in and studied my roofline, my tarp, the way my boat sat in the water. She was looking for signs. A tarp on a roof could mean rain catchment. Rain catchment could mean a living person. Her partner whispered something. I could not hear the words, only the tone. Quiet and controlled. The aluminum boat drifted closer. I felt my teeth pressed together. I did not want to fight. I did not want to be seen. I wanted them to decide I was empty. The man raised his hand and pointed at my window coverings. He tilted his head. The woman lowered binoculars and stared with naked eyes. Then she did something that made my stomach drop. She pulled a small flashlight from her pocket and flicked it on for a half second. aiming it at my windows. A quick flash, a test. If someone is inside, he might react. If light leaks out, it shows. If curtains shift, it shows. I did nothing. The light blinked off. The woman waited, then flicked it again, half-second. Still nothing. The aluminum boat drifted another 10 yards. The man picked up his paddle and dipped it shallow, turning the boat slightly so the bow pointed away. He whispered again, sharper. The woman kept staring. Then she nodded once, slow, and the boat turned and moved on. They did not leave the channel. They continued searching deeper. That told me the worst part. They were mapping this area. They were learning where boats hid. They would be back. Maybe not tomorrow, but back. Searchers always returned to spots that felt promising. That night, I packed my bags again and checked fuel. The houseboat had a half tank, enough for a short move, not enough to run around burning circles. Fuel was gold now. I found spare fuel cans in a rear locker, both half full, and I almost smiled until I remembered what spare fuel means. Spare fuel means the owner planned to come back. The owner did not. I poured a little fuel into a smaller container for emergency use and sealed it tight. Fuel smell carries. You do not spill fuel and walk away. You clean it or you leave the whole area. I cleaned it. I wiped the funnel. I wiped the deck. I wiped my hands and then wiped them again. I moved the next night, deeper into the river system using the current and minimal engine. I kept to dark water and shadows, staying off open stretches where moonlight turns the surface into a bright sheet. I did not use lights. I watched shoreline shapes and listened for other motors. Twice I killed my engine and drifted because I heard something ahead. Once it was nothing, just wind in trees. Once it was a boat far off, running too fast, throwing a wake. That boat was not stealthy. That boat was confident. Confident boats carry people who do not worry about consequences. Those are the boats that circle. I found a quiet cove tucked behind a bend where an old wooden pier stuck out from a private property that looked abandoned. The house behind it had dark windows and a porch piled with debris. A flag hung limp on the pole, dirty and torn. I stayed off the pier. Piers hold infected sometimes. Infected wander down them and get stuck. I anchored off to one side where the bottom was mud and the trees hung low. From the main river, you could not see me unless you came around the bend and looked into this pocket of then. Branches broke up the outline. I set the anchor and listened. No movement on the pier, no footsteps, no banging. Quiet. Quiet was a resource. Days passed. Heat turned to cooler evenings. The weather shifted in small ways that mattered. A cold front rolled in one afternoon, and the wind slapped the water hard enough to rock the houseboat. I tightened lines and checked the anchor and watched the tree branches bend. Storms are dangerous on a boat because storms force you to do work when you want to hide. Storms also cover noise. That is the trade. When rain hit hard, I boiled water and ate a hot meal and even allowed myself one small luxury. I opened a can of peaches I found buried in a cupboard, ate half, and sealed the rest in a bag. Sugar becomes a memory you can taste. I did not let myself linger on it. On day 31, I heard voices again. Real voices, close, coming from the direction of the pier. Two people, a man and a woman, talking low but not whispering. They were on the property, not on a boat. That meant they came in on foot, or they had been living nearby. I sank to the floor and moved to my pinhole, heart not pounding, but my hands going very deliberate. I watched the pier through branches. The man appeared first. Mid-30s maybe, beard, baseball cap, backpack. He carried a pry bar in one hand. The woman followed, hair tied back, jacket zipped, carrying a duffel. Both looked around with the fast, scanning movements of people who expect trouble. They stepped onto the pier and stopped. The man pointed at something on the boards. The woman crouched, touched it, then stood fast and wiped her hand on her pants. That gesture told me there was dried grime, maybe blood, maybe something else. The man looked out over the water, and his eyes landed on my houseboat position. He did not see me right away, but he saw the shape, the shadow behind branches. He lifted binoculars. I held still. There was no hiding the boat if he took time. The only hope was that he decided it was not worth it. He stared a long time, then lowered binoculars and said something to the woman. She looked, then shrugged, a small motion. The man stepped to the end of the pier and cupped his hands around his mouth. He did not yell. He called in a controlled voice, "Boat out there! Anybody alive?" The sound rolled across the cove and landed against my hull. For a second, my throat tightened and my mouth felt dry. Then I forced myself to stay silent. Silence is safety. Silence is also a choice you make that costs you later. He waited, listening. The woman shifted her weight, eyes sweeping the tree line and the water. "We can trade," the man called again. "Food for fuel, or water, or info." He paused, then added, "No trouble." He sounded sincere. That meant nothing. Sincere people still panic. Sincere people still turn into threats when they see what you have. I stayed silent. The man exhaled hard and looked at the woman. She shook her head once. Then they did something that made me tense for real. They walked back toward the house, not leaving, not giving up. They were going to search. I had to decide fast. If they searched the property and decided the pier was safe, they might launch something. If they found a canoe, they might come out to me. If they found nothing, they might still camp here, and then every night I would hear them, and every morning I would risk being spotted. I could move, but moving in daylight was risky, and moving at night meant waiting while they were here. I chose a third option. I made myself a decoy and a boundary. I pulled a jacket from my bag and stuffed it with towels to give it a shoulder shape. I tied it to a mop handle I found in the closet and set it near the rear window behind a small gap in the covering. Not a bright gap, just enough that a person on the pier with binoculars might catch a hint of something human. Then that I taped the gap so it did not leak light and left only a faint, darker shape behind the black. It was a risk, but it was controlled. Then I wrote a note on paper with a blunt pencil. "Sick on board. Do not approach. Move on." I did not mention infected. I did not mention threat. I used the kind of words people fear without needing explanation. I waited until the man and woman reappeared on the porch carrying something heavy between them. Maybe a box, maybe supplies. They moved toward the pier again. I cracked my rear door just enough to slide the note out and taped it to the railing at the end of the pier using a strip of bright tape I saved for emergencies. Bright tape would catch attention. That was the point. I did it fast, low, using the pier itself as cover. Then I retreated to my boat and shut the door and waited in darkness. They saw the note within minutes. The man walked to it, read it, and froze in place. The woman leaned in, read it, and stepped back fast, wiping her hands again even though she did not touch anything. The man lifted binoculars and stared out at my boat, then stared again. His body posture changed. His shoulders tightened. He looked away toward the house, then back. I watched him weigh risk. Risk is the only thing people understand now. He spoke to the woman. She shook her head hard, more than before. She pointed back toward the tree line, toward where they came from. She wanted to leave. The man still stood there for another long count, then finally nodded. He peeled the note off the railing using 2 fingers, held it away from his body, and tossed it into the water. Then he backed away from the pier and walked fast toward the house. Within 10 minutes, both of them were gone into the trees, moving quick, not looking back. The cove fell quiet again. My hands stayed busy for an hour after that, checking knots, checking tape seams, wiping surfaces. I did not celebrate. I knew I just painted a target on my own mind. I used fear to protect myself. Fear works until it does not. 2 days later, a boat came. Not the same aluminum search boat from before. Not the careful, slow kind. This one was a bigger fishing boat with an outboard that growled loud and steady. It came around the bend mid-morning, sun high, water smooth. The boat had 3 men in it. One at the helm, one standing, one sitting with his head turning in sharp snaps. The standing man held binoculars. The sitting man held a long object across his lap again. The boat slowed when it entered the cove. The standing man looked straight toward my hiding spot. That meant someone told him about it. That meant the man and woman from the pier had gone somewhere and talked. The boat did not come straight at me. It did what I feared most. It started circling. A wide loop first, far out, staying near the middle of the cove. Then another loop closer. The men were scanning for signs, trying to read the water, trying to see the shape behind branches. The wake from their circle slapped my hull, making small rhythmic bumps against the anchor line. Every bump felt loud. I stayed off the floorboards and kept my eyes on the pinhole. The standing man pointed once, and the helm man adjusted course. They were closing. I had minutes to act and no good choices. If I stayed, they might come alongside and board. If I started the engine, they would hear it and know I was alive. If I waited until night, they might still be here. Circling boats can wait. They have fuel and confidence. They can anchor and watch. If they saw any movement behind my coverings, they would commit. I decided to leave now, in daylight, using the only advantage I still had. My boat was already set to move, and I knew my own routines better than they could. I crawled to the engine compartment and got everything ready by touch. I loosened the anchor tie-off just enough that I could free it fast. I checked the rear door latch so it would not bang. I took my 2 bags and put them by the helm. I kept my face low, not letting it appear in a window gap. Then I waited for the circle to bring them to the far side of the cove, where they would have trees between them and me for a few seconds. When they passed behind the thickest cluster of branches, I moved. I started the engine. It caught on the first turn, loud for a heartbeat, then settled into a low rumble. I freed the anchor line and hauled fast, hand over hand, chain clinking softly, but the engine covered it. I did not pull it all the way. I did not have time. I pulled until it broke free, then tied it off with chain still hanging. I would deal with it later. I put the boat in forward and eased out, using the minimum throttle to avoid throwing a big wake. Wake draws eyes. Wake shows direction. I kept the bow pointed toward the narrow exit behind reeds, not back toward the main river. I wanted them to think I was heading out the obvious way. The circling boat heard my engine instantly. The standing man snapped his head toward me. I saw his arm lift, pointing. The helm man turned hard. Their boat surged forward, cutting across the cove. The wake from his turn slapped against the pier and rolled back. He was coming. I did not panic. I focused on one thing: exit the cove without exposing my full side profile, and use the reeds to break sight. My houseboat moved slow. That is the curse of it. That is also its strength, because slow movement can look natural, not desperate. I kept it steady. Their boat closed distance fast, then slowed when it hit shallower water near the reeds. Outboards do not love shallow weeds. They chew them up. The helm man backed off, then tried a wider angle. That gave me a gap. I slid into the narrower channel behind the reeds, where the water stayed deeper, a path I found earlier by poling. The reeds brushed my hull with soft, whispering contact that sounded huge in my head. I kept throttle low. I heard their outboard rev, then drop, rev again. They were trying to follow. Then I heard something else, sharp and ugly, a hull scrape. They hit bottom. The standing man shouted. I could not make out the words, but the tone was frustration turning to anger. I did not look back. Looking back costs time. I kept forward. The narrow channel curved, and the reeds grew thicker, and the water turned dark under the canopy. When the channel finally opened into a broader backwater, I killed the engine instantly and let momentum carry me behind a line of trees overhanging the water. Then I drifted. Drift is silent. Drift is invisible if you choose the right shadow. I heard their boat in the reeds, engine revving, then cutting, then revving again. I heard another scrape. I heard a bang that could have been a fist on fiberglass. Their voices carried now, sharper, less controlled. Anger makes men loud. Loud men draw infected. I stayed still, letting the houseboat slide deeper into the shadow. My anchor chain still hung partially in the water. I hated that, but I could not fix it now. I watched through my pinhole toward the channel entrance. The reeds moved. The bow of their fishing boat pushed through, then stopped. The helm man reversed, trying to back out. Weeds wrapped his prop. The engine note changed, strained. He killed it. The three men stood up, looking around, trying to find me. One lifted binoculars and scanned. Another pointed toward my general direction, but trees blocked his view. Then a new sound cut through the mess, a moan from the shoreline, close. Then another. Then the sound of feet slipping in mud and branches snapping. The men froze. Anger disappeared fast. They turned toward the bank. Two infected stumbled out from the brush, drawn by the engine noise and yelling. More followed, not running, just coming, mouths open, arms out, moving with that relentless commitment. The men backed toward their boat. One swung the long object up and aimed. I did not watch the details. I watched the consequences. A loud crack split the air. The sound rolled down the backwater and bounced off trees. Birds exploded upward from branches. The infected surged forward faster, not smart, just pulled by the sound. Another crack. Another. The men shouted now, trying to manage the boat and the shoreline at the same time. The outboard coughed as they tried to start it again. The prop thrashed weeds. The boat rocked. The infected reached the stern and grabbed at the transom. The men shoved them off with paddles and boots. It was chaos. It was loud. It was everything I avoided. I used that chaos. I started my engine for 5 seconds, just enough to slide farther back into the shadow behind the tree line, then killed it again. The movement was small, but mattered. If they broke free and came searching, I wanted distance. I wanted angles. I wanted obstacles between us. The men finally got their boat to move, the engine screaming high because the prop still chewed weeds. They lurched forward, dragging infected hands off the stern. One infected fell into the water and floated, arms still reaching. The men did not stop. They shoved through the reeds again and vanished toward the cove, leaving the shoreline infected, milling and moaning in confusion. I sat in darkness with the engine off and listened until the last trace of their motor faded. Then I listened longer. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were sharp and fast, counting risks. Those men would blame someone. If they survived and escaped, they would talk. People talk more after fear. They would tell others there was a houseboat hidden in the reeds. Maybe they would come back with more boats. Maybe they would come back with better planning. Staying in this river system meant this would happen again. Circling does not stop once it starts. It only changes shape. That evening, I moved again, but I did it slow, drifting and using current, keeping engine bursts short and timed with wind gusts. I navigated away from marinas and away from private piers. I aimed for open water where there were fewer hiding spots for other boats. That sounds backward, but hiding spots help hunters. Open water gives you sight lines. Open water also forces you to manage your own visibility. I chose a stretch of river that widened into a shallow lake, dotted with small islands of brush. I anchored near one of those islands so I had cover, but also a clear view of anyone approaching. I set the anchor properly this time, pulling chain in and tying it clean. I checked it twice. I needed the boat to behave. Over the next weeks, I built my silent fortress into something that could actually last. I reinforced the blackout coverings with better materials scavenged from other boats that drifted near enough for me to reach without exposing myself. I used the dinghy for the first time, inflating it by hand pump during a windy afternoon when the water was choppy enough to cover the squeaks. I paddled to a half-sunk pontoon that had washed up against reeds. I kept my movements small and quick. I took what mattered and left what did not. A bundle of rope, a roll of tarp, a bag of canned food, a second propane canister, a solar garden light that I smashed on purpose for its small, rechargeable battery. I could use it for a tiny interior light if I needed, but only under blankets. Light discipline never stopped. I made a rain catchment system that did not flap. I learned to tension the tarp with bungee cords and lines so it sat tight, angled, and quiet. I added a second catch point so I could fill 2 jugs in one rain. I built a simple filter stack from cloth and charcoal I scavenged from a ruined grill on a floating dock section. I did not pretend it made water pure. I still boiled. Boiling took fuel, so I learned to use the sun when it was safe. I put clear bottles on the roof under a cover that blocked reflections, letting heat work slowly. I did not trust it alone. I used it to reduce boil time. Every small gain mattered. Food was the next system. Fishing gave me protein, but fishing every day makes a pattern. Rod tip on deck at the same time each afternoon becomes something a distant watcher can notice. I shifted to fishing at irregular times and using quieter methods. A simple line dropped at midnight when the wind picked up. A small net set under the stern and checked before dawn. I also started trapping crabs in shallow areas with a basket I made from wire and scrap. Crabs are messy, but they keep well for a short time in a bucket of water if you keep it shaded. I cooked small and cleaned immediately. I kept smell under control. I also learned that my biggest weakness was waste. Human waste, food scraps, dirty water. Waste is smell. Waste is gulls. Waste is a trail. I set a strict routine. Bucket toilet with a lid, lined with heavy bags when I had them. When a bag filled, I tied it tight and stored it in a sealed container on the stern under a cover until I could dump it in deep moving water far from my anchor spot. Not near shore, not near reeds, not where anything could wash back. I did the same with fish remains and food scraps. It was unpleasant work, but it kept the fortress from becoming a stink beacon. Every so often, I heard the circlers again. Not always the same boat, but the same behavior. Engines slowing near islands, boats drifting without wake, binoculars glinting in sunlight. The first time I saw a glint, I adjusted my entire setup. Reflections are a giveaway. My tarp could reflect. My window coverings could reflect if any plastic faced out. Even a metal railing could flash. I wrapped shiny surfaces with dull cloth and tape. I moved my rain catchment angle to keep it from catching sun. I stopped going on deck in full daylight, even under cover. I learned to do deck work at dawn and dusk when glare was lower. I started wearing dark clothing, not because it made me invisible, but because it made me less readable through narrow gaps. Around the end of the second month, I found proof that boats were not just searching for supplies. Boats were hunting people. I saw it through my pinhole on a bright afternoon. A small kayak came into the lake from the far side, paddled by a young man. He moved with the tired rhythm of someone who has been doing it for hours. His kayak sat low, loaded with bags. He aimed for an island shore, probably to rest. He did not see the motorboat tucked behind a larger island until it was too late. The motorboat cut out and drifted, then surged forward in a burst that threw a wake. Two men stood up in it, one shouting, one pointing. The kayaker froze for a second, then paddled hard. Hard paddling makes splashes. Splashes make panic visible from far away. The motorboat closed fast. It did not bump him. It did not ram him. It boxed him in against the shallow bank and forced him to stop. The men leaned over, grabbed the kayak bow, and held it steady. One man spoke fast, gesturing toward the bags. The kayaker held his paddle across his lap and looked around. He had nowhere to go. I could not hear words, but I saw the rhythm of a demand. The kayaker opened a bag and held something up. Maybe food, maybe medicine. The man shook his head and pointed at another bag. The kayaker hesitated, then opened it. The men reached in and started taking. The kayaker sat rigid, not fighting. Fighting would get him pushed into water, and water would drown him or leave him stranded. He made a survival choice. I watched, motionless, and felt my jaw tighten until it ached. I did not move. I did not intervene. Intervention draws attention. Intervention gets you killed. After the men stripped what they wanted, they shoved the kayak away. One of them laughed and made a waving gesture, mocking. The motorboat spun and left, wake slapping the kayak sideways. The kayaker sat still for a long time, then paddled away in a slower, defeated rhythm. He did not come toward my island. He left the lake entirely. That scene told me a harsh truth. A person on the water is not automatically safer. A person on the water is isolated. A person on the water is easy to corner. My silent fortress kept me alive not because it floated, but because it stayed unseen. That night, I made another change. I started building a secondary escape option. The dinghy could carry me short distances, but it was slow and exposed. I needed something that could move without an engine and without a paddle splash. I found a sculling oar on a drifting sailboat that had washed into reeds one morning. I risked going out to it at dawn, working fast. I dragged the oar back and mounted a simple bracket on my stern rail. Sculling is quiet if you do it right. It makes the boat move slow, but slow is fine. Slow means control. Slow means no engine. Slow means less sound. I practiced on windy evenings when any weird motion would be hidden in the chop. Within a week, I could move the houseboat 100 yards without starting the motor. That was a major upgrade. The first time I had to use it for real happened on a night with no moon. The lake was dark, the air cool, and the water surface smooth enough to show faint reflections of the stars. Smooth water is dangerous. Smooth water shows everything. I heard an engine far off and ignored it at first. Engines exist. People move. Then the sound got closer, steady, deliberate. I moved to my seam and watched the far side of the lake. A small boat with a single dim light. Not bright, just a faint glow near the bow. That light was shielded. Someone was navigating, not advertising. The boat slowed and cut its engine, then drifted. I watched it sit there motionless for a long count. That was not a traveler. That was a watcher. The watcher's light blinked off. Then it blinked on again, aimed not forward but sideways, scanning the water surface. The beam was narrow and controlled. It swept the shoreline of islands and paused on certain spots, checking. I stayed in darkness, barely breathing, hands placed on the floor so I would not shift. The beam moved again and landed closer. It swept across the open water between islands. Then it paused, and I felt my mouth go dry. It paused in my direction. Not on me directly, but near enough that any movement on my deck could flash. Any reflective surface could answer. I kept still. The beam swept away, then came back, slower. The watcher was tightening his search, circling, but in a different form. I did not start the engine. I did not want to give him a sound to lock onto. I went to the stern, took position behind the covered doorway, and set my hands on the sculling oar. I started moving the boat in slow, quiet strokes, using the island's shadow to cover the shift. The boat drifted at first, then began to slide sideways relative to my old anchor position. I had already loosened my anchor line earlier that evening, a habit I adopted for quick movement. I pulled it in hand over hand, slow, and secured it. The boat moved, silent, and the shoreline shadow swallowed me. The beam swept again and hit the spot where I had been. It lingered there. Then it moved, sweeping wider, confused. The watcher did not see me move because I moved without wake and without light. The boat slid into a darker pocket behind the island's thicker brush. I stopped sculling and waited. The watcher's engine started again, low, then higher, and the boat moved closer to the spot he suspected. He searched there for a long time. He never shined the beam directly on my new position. After what felt like an hour, he turned away and motored off toward the main river. The sound faded. I sat on the floor and did not move for a long time. My hands kept rubbing tape edges out of habit. That night proved the fortress idea was working. It also proved that someone out there had the patience to hunt in the dark. By the time the weather started cooling in a real way, with mornings in the low 50s Fahrenheit and evenings that made condensation form on surfaces, I had been on the houseboat long enough that it felt less borrowed and more earned. Earned through constant work. The boat looked dead from the outside. That was the goal. Inside, I had a system. Water lined up under the bed, food sealed and stacked low, tools within reach, a small interior light made from a salvaged battery, and an old flashlight head, wrapped in cloth so it barely glowed. I only used it when I was buried under a blanket, so even a pinhole seam could not show it. I kept my watch and my routine strict. Comfort creates laziness. Laziness creates mistakes. The infected on shore changed with the season too. As days cooled, movement slowed. Not stopped, just slower. The infected would stand in place longer, heads angled, reacting to sounds with delayed commitment. That helped, but it also made them linger. A lingering infected near a shoreline becomes a marker. People see it and think, something noisy happened there, something alive, something worth checking. I stayed farther out, and when I heard infected gather on a bank, I moved at night to avoid having a crowd near my hiding place. I stopped thinking of anchor spots as homes. I started thinking of them as temporary masks. One afternoon in early fall, I saw something that almost broke my rules. A girl, maybe 15 or 16, standing on a broken dock section drifting near the far side of the lake. She wore a bright hoodie that had faded. She waved both arms over her head. She held something white in one hand, maybe a towel, maybe a shirt, waving it. She was trying to be seen. That is the opposite of what I did. Behind her, on the bank, I saw movement. 3 infected, slow, drifting toward the dock section from the mud, pulled by her motion. The girl backed up, almost falling, then steadied herself. She looked trapped between water and infected. I stayed still for a long count, fighting myself without drama. The truth is simple. If I go to her, I become visible. If I tow her, I become visible longer. If I pull her on board, I bring a person into my fortress. People bring needs. People bring noise. People bring risk. If I do nothing, she might die. I do not know her name. I do not know her story. I do know what it does to a person to watch someone die and then keep living anyway. I have enough of that in my head already. I made a choice that split the difference, and I hate that I had to make it. I inflated the dinghy behind my blackout door, pumping slow, timing squeaks with wind. I paddled out low and fast, keeping strokes quiet. I did not head straight at her. I angled in from behind a small island so I would not appear in open water. When I emerged, I kept my head down and did not speak. The girl saw me and her face tightened. She tried to wave again, but I raised one hand in a sharp gesture for silence. She froze, then nodded. The infected on the bank heard the splash of her earlier panic and were already committed. They stepped onto the drifting dock section, boards creaking. The girl backed away until her heels hit water. I reached her and grabbed the edge of the dock section, using it as a barrier. I held out the dinghy bow. I did not offer my hand. Hands get grabbed. I pointed at the dinghy and then at her feet, showing her where to step. She stepped in, shaking, trying not to splash. One infected lurched closer and grabbed at her hoodie sleeve. Fabric stretched. The girl made a small sound that she swallowed. I shoved the infected's arm away with the paddle blade hard. It snarled and stumbled. Another infected stepped onto the dock section, boards groaning. The structure shifted under their weight. That was my moment. I pushed off with all my weight, using the dock section itself to give the dinghy momentum away. The girl crouched low. I paddled, fast and controlled, toward the island shadow. We did not talk. Talking carries. The girl's eyes stayed wide, fixed on the water and the infected behind. I kept my strokes steady, minimizing splash. The infected stepped off the dock section into water and stalled, confused at depth. One fell forward and floated for a moment, arms still reaching, then sank slightly and bobbed. The other 2 stood in knee-deep water and moaned, following the dinghy with their heads. That sound carried, but wind helped. I did not look back again. I paddled until the dinghy touched my houseboat stern, tucked under shadow. I signaled the girl to stay low and hold the line. I climbed aboard first, then helped her up by her elbow, quick and quiet. Inside the houseboat, I sat her on the floor and handed her a bottle of water. She drank too fast at first, then slowed when I gave her a look. I could see she wanted to cry. She did not. She wiped her face with the sleeve the infected had grabbed, then looked at the darkness of my covered windows. Her voice came out a whisper. "Are you alone?" I answered with the minimum. "Yes," she swallowed. "My dad." I raised my hand again, not cruel, just strict. "Later," I whispered. "Quiet now." She nodded, eyes dropping to the floor. Her hands were dirty and scraped. No bleeding that looked serious. No smell of infection. No obvious bite. I still did not trust anything, but I could not examine her with a bright light without breaking my own rules. I gave her a clean cloth and pointed toward the bathroom. "Wash, quiet." She moved carefully, understanding more than I expected. For 2 days, she stayed. 2 days is a short time and a long time on a boat. A person changes the air. A person changes sound. Even when she was silent, I could hear her shift on the floor, could hear her swallow, could hear her stomach make noise. She tried to help, and I had to stop her twice because help often means noise. On the second night, I finally let her speak in a low voice while wind hammered the lake and rain hit the roof loud enough to cover us. She said her name was Kendra. She said her dad had a small fishing cabin upriver. She said he sent her to the water with a kayak when men came to their place demanding food. She said she paddled until her arms stopped cooperating, then drifted into this lake and got trapped on that broken dock section when she tried to rest. She did not dramatize it. She said it plain, which made it worse. She asked me what I would do with her. That was the question I expected and hated. I told her the truth. "I cannot keep you here long. People see patterns. 2 people make more pattern than 1. She nodded, jaw tight. She asked if I could take her upriver. I did not answer right away because promises get people killed. I asked how far. She named a bend and a bridge and a billboard. Details that sounded real. It was about 15 miles. Too far for my fuel if I had to run fast. Too far to paddle in a dinghy without being seen. Too far to drift without days of exposure. I told her what I could do. "I can get you closer. I can get you to a place with cover. Then you go the rest." She looked down, then nodded once. She did not beg. That made it harder. On the 3rd night, I moved the houseboat with minimal engine, using sculling where I could. I chose a route that kept us near tree lines and away from marinas. Kendra stayed low and silent. She followed my hand signals without question. I respected her for that. We made it to a stretch of river where an old barge had sunk near the bank, leaving a jagged, rusted shape that broke up sight lines. I anchored behind it in shadow. I pointed toward a narrow inlet that led to smaller backwaters. "Go there at dawn," I whispered. "Stay off the main river. If you see boats, hide." She nodded, lips pressed tight. She held her backpack straps and looked at me, eyes searching. "Thank you," she whispered. I did not answer with anything grand. I just nodded. Words do not fix the world. Actions do. At dawn, with fog low on the water, I inflated the dinghy again and paddled her close to the inlet entrance, then let her go. I watched her disappear into gray water and reeds. I stayed there for a long count, making sure no boat followed her, making sure no engine sound rose, making sure no shout echoed. Then I paddled back and pulled the dinghy up and deflated it and stowed it. The houseboat returned to being a single silent box. The inside felt emptier after a person leaves. Empty can be relief. Empty can also be a warning. Helping people creates threads. Threads get followed. A week after Kendra left, I saw a boat circling again in the distance. It did not come close. It stayed far out on the main river, moving slow, scanning shorelines. It might have been random. It might have been connected. I could not know, and not knowing is a pressure that builds. I moved anyway. I moved that same night, putting miles behind me, choosing a new stretch of water that felt less traveled. I anchored near a cluster of small islands where the water was deeper and the shores were mostly mud and reeds, not docks. Docks attract people. Reeds attract mosquitoes and silence. I chose mosquitoes and silence. The season kept turning. Nights dropped into the 40s Fahrenheit. My breath stopped fogging inside the cabin because I kept the interior temperature closer to outside by not running heat, not running anything. I did not have heat anyway. I had blankets and layers. Cold is manageable. Attention is not. The first frost hit one morning and the roof tarp crinkled under a thin film of ice. Ice makes noise when it breaks. I learned to handle it slow. I learned to keep water jugs from freezing by wrapping them and storing them low. I learned to fish less and rely more on canned food when fishing became less consistent. I hated eating cans because cans are finite. Fish can come back. Still, you do what you have to do. One night, late fall, my worst fear almost happened. I was inside, mid-evening, wind low, water smooth. I had just finished wiping down a pan. My hands were damp. I reached for a towel and knocked a metal spoon off the counter. It hit the floor with a sharp clack that sounded enormous. I froze with my hand still extended. I did not move for a long count. Outside, across the water, I heard a faint response, a moan, distant but real, then another. The sound carried, bounced. I heard movement on a shoreline, feet dragging in mud. Then I heard something else that made my throat go tight. A faint human voice far off, asking, "Hello?" Not loud, not close, but close enough that my mistake might have been heard. I sank to the floor and moved to my seam. In the distance, on the main river, I saw a small boat drifting, no engine, a person standing on it with a flashlight. The beam flicked on and off, not sweeping wildly, but testing the dark. The person had heard something and was checking. My spoon. My one mistake. I watched the beam land on the water surface, then sweep, then pause. The boat drifted closer. The person called again. "Anybody there?" He sounded cautious, not aggressive. That did not matter. Cautious people still take. Cautious people still talk to others. If he saw my boat, he would mark it. I did not start the engine. I did not scull. I did the simplest thing. I became dead. I sat completely still, not even adjusting my posture, and waited. The boat drifted, beam flicking. Then wind rose slightly, a soft ripple across the water. The beam danced on the ripples and made it harder to see anything stable. The person hesitated, then turned his beam toward the shoreline, maybe deciding the sound came from there. The boat drifted away, not toward me. After 10 minutes, the engine started low, and the boat moved off downriver. I stayed still for another full hour, punishing myself with silence. When I finally reached down and picked up the spoon, my fingers closed around it with controlled pressure, and I put it away without any sound. That spoon became a lesson I will never forget. Winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in with colder mornings, shorter days, and a new kind of quiet. People moved less, boats moved less. That should have felt safer, but it came with a different risk. In winter, smoke stands out more. Light stands out more. Sound stands out more because the air is crisp and still. Also, hungry people get worse. Hungry people take bigger risks. Hungry people circle longer. Hungry people listen harder. I kept my fortress silent and lived small. I ate cold food more often to avoid venting heat and smell. I drank rainwater that tasted slightly of roof and plastic, and I did not complain. I slept in layers and woke often to listen. The big winter event came in early January, after a week of gray skies and a hard rain that turned to sleet. That night, the wind shifted and hit my anchor spot in a way I had not planned for. The houseboat yawed, pulling on the anchor line. The line creaked, the hull rotated, slowly at first, then more, until the stern pointed toward open water. I felt the change even inside. Boats tell you when they are unhappy. I crawled to the hatch and listened. The wind outside was strong enough to cover a lot, but it also meant branches could scrape, and scraping can tear coverings, and torn coverings let light leak. I had to act. If my anchor dragged, I could end up drifting into open water where any passing boat might see me at dawn. Or worse, I could drift into a shoreline and get stuck. Being stuck is death. I went to the helm and started the engine. The sound felt obscene in the winter quiet, but the wind helped cover it. I kept it low and used it only to ease forward against the pull, relieving strain on the anchor line. I hauled anchor chain by hand, muscles burning in a controlled way, not dramatic, just necessary. The chain came up heavy and cold, water pouring off it. I felt the anchor bump free, then catch again. Good, I repositioned, moving 20 yards to a spot with better shelter from the wind, and dropped anchor again. The chain rattled once against the bow roller. I winced and waited. No response from shore. Wind kept screaming through trees. I cut the engine and sat in darkness, letting the boat settle. That was the longest 3 minutes of engine noise I had made in weeks. I hated it. I survived it. 2 days after that storm, the circlers came again. Not a big group, not a fleet, just one boat, medium size, moving slow along the far channel. I saw it through my seam in the afternoon light. It paused now and then, letting wakes settle, scanning shorelines. It did not come straight into my island cluster, but it did not leave either. It was doing the wide circle method, checking every pocket. That boat was patient. Patience is dangerous. I did not move immediately, because moving can expose you if the watcher has a good angle. I waited until dusk, when the light fell flat and shadows deepened. Then I used the sculling oar and drift to shift my position behind a different island, keeping trees between me and the main channel. I moved slow enough that even if he stared, he might assume it was just drift. The boat kept scanning until dark. Then a small light blinked on, shielded, and the boat turned away and left. He did not find me, but he proved something important. People still had fuel in winter. People still had motive. The river was not empty. It only looked empty until someone decided to search. I made a choice after that. A hard one, but one that felt inevitable. I could not keep playing hide and shift forever in the same region. If I stayed here, eventually someone would get lucky. Luck kills you. I needed to move to water that fewer people could reach with motorboats. I needed shallow, winding, ugly water. The kind of water that tears props and slows hunters. Over the next week, I prepared for a longer relocation. I saved fuel. I stopped all unnecessary engine starts. I gathered supplies into sealed bags. I secured everything that could rattle. I reinforced blackout coverings again. I tested the dinghy for leaks. I mapped my route by memory and by observing current flow and shoreline landmarks during daylight from my pinhole. I chose a route into a backwater swampy system where the river split into narrow channels and old dead trees rose out of the water. That place would be miserable. It would also be hard to navigate at speed. Hard to navigate at speed means hard to chase. I left on a night with low cloud cover and a cold drizzle that turned the world into a muted gray. I ran the engine in short bursts, using it to line up turns, then cutting it and drifting through narrow stretches. Dead trees loomed as dark shapes. Branches reached low over the water, and I had to duck on deck once, moving carefully with no light. My hands felt numb from cold water spray. I did not stop. Stopping in narrow channels is a risk, because you can get turned sideways. I used the sculling oar more than I expected, pushing the stern around obstacles with quiet force. At one point, the hull brushed a submerged log and made a dull thud. I froze and listened. Nothing followed. I kept moving. By dawn, I was deep in the backwater system. The main river sound was gone. The air smelled of mud and decay and wet wood. The water was darker here, stained by vegetation. The channels twisted and widened and twisted again. I found a spot where 3 dead trees formed a natural screen, and I anchored behind them. From any angle, my houseboat looked like part of the cluttered swamp, another dark block among dark trunks. The only danger here was getting trapped by shallow water if levels dropped, and the constant risk of insects and damp ruining my supplies. I accepted those risks. I chose them. Better damp than circling boats. Days in the backwater were harder. Fishing changed. The water held different fish, and sometimes my line came up with nothing but weeds. Rain catchment still worked, but the roof iced more often, and ice made small cracking sounds that made me tense. The infected still existed, wandering banks, sometimes wading into shallow water and getting stuck against fallen trees. I learned to avoid those zones because trapped infected make noise, and noise can attract humans. Humans still came here sometimes, but less often. When they did, I heard them sooner because sound carries in narrow channels. I learned to read the difference between a bird splash and a paddle dip. I learned to freeze and become dead the moment a sound felt wrong. Late in winter, I got a sign that Kendra might have made it. It came in the form of a small fire far off, seen through bare trees at dusk. Just a glow, low, controlled, hidden behind brush. Smoke did not rise high, which meant the fire was shielded or short. I watched it for a long time. It could have been anyone. It could have been bait. It could have been a camp of people. Still, I did not see reckless movement. I did not hear loud voices. I did not hear engines. The glow faded after an hour. That felt intentional, not accidental. I did not go toward it. I did not call out. I did something else. I took a piece of cloth and wrote 2 words on it with charcoal. Stay quiet. I tied it to a branch near a channel intersection where someone traveling by canoe might see it. It was a risk, leaving any sign, but it was small and vague. If Kendra was out there and saw it, she would understand. If someone else saw it, it would mean nothing. Spring came slowly. The water level rose. The backwater channels widened. That made navigation easier, which was a mixed blessing. Easier navigation meant more boats could come. It also meant my houseboat was less likely to get stranded. I used the rising water to relocate deeper into the system, choosing spots that required careful turns and shallow approaches. I kept my blackout fortress intact. I kept my routines. I stayed alive. That is the part people want to hear, the part where the plan works and you settle into it. The truth is, the plan never stops changing. Survival is not one trick. It is 1,000 small decisions made every day, and most of them are boring, until one is not. The moment that proved it happened on a clear spring morning when birds were loud and the air felt almost normal. I was on the roof deck for the first time in days, checking the tarp tension and cleaning debris from the catchment area. I chose that time because the wind was up and the channel noise was high, masking my movements. I kept low and worked fast. Then I heard an engine, faint but real, coming through the backwater. Engines do not belong here. I dropped flat behind the roof edge and stayed still, eyes scanning through branches. The engine sound grew, then cut, then grew again. Someone was navigating carefully, using bursts to avoid hitting logs. That meant experience. Experience means danger. A small John boat emerged around a bend, pushed by an outboard on low. 2 men in it, both wearing dark jackets, both scanning. One held binoculars, the other held a paddle ready. They moved slow, eyes searching for anything out of place. In a swamp, out of place can mean a boat that does not belong, or a tarp that looks too clean, or a rope that is too straight. My boat was hidden behind dead trees, but not invisible. If they got close enough, they could see the angles. I slid off the roof silently and down into the cabin, shutting the hatch soft, and moved to my seam. The John boat drifted closer, and the binocular man swept his view across my tree screen. He paused. I felt my body lock down, not from some dramatic rush, but from the knowledge that one mistake now could undo months. The man pointed. The helm man adjusted course. They were coming straight toward my pocket. My mind did not spin. It went simple. If they came close, they would see me. If they saw me, they would either demand something or take everything. If they took everything, I would die later. I needed to vanish without an engine. I needed to move without giving them a sound to follow. I loosened my anchor line and began pulling it in slow, keeping chain from clinking. I used a cloth to wrap around the chain where it met metal, muffling contact. My hands worked steady. The John boat kept coming, now close enough that I could see the shape of the man's beard and the brim of his cap. He lifted binoculars again and stared. Then the helm man cut the motor and let the boat glide. He was trying to listen. That was the worst part. He knew noise discipline. I finished hauling the anchor free and tied it off. Then I used the sculling oar, gentle, to start sliding backward into a darker pocket behind thicker trees. The movement was slow and looked natural. The John boat drifted forward, still gliding. The binocular man kept staring at the spot where I had been, but the angle shifted. Trees changed the view. Shadows swallowed edges. My boat became just another dark shape. The John boat's bow bumped lightly into a floating branch and made a small sound. The helm man flinched and steadied it. They were close now. If he looked 10 degrees right, he might see me. If he looked 10 degrees left, he might miss me. I kept sculling. I did not stop. Then a new sound saved me. Not a miracle, just physics. The John boat's hull scraped a submerged log, a low grating noise. The helm man cursed under his breath, not loud. The binocular man snapped his head down to check their position. That moment of distraction mattered. Their boat drifted another few feet and got caught in thicker debris, forcing the helm man to use the paddle to push free. That movement splashed. The splash echoed. On the far bank, an infected that had been standing still lifted its head and moaned. Another answered. The men froze. They listened. The binocular man lowered his glasses and stared toward the moans. His focus shifted. I used that shift. I sculled harder, still controlled, sliding my houseboat deeper into shadow until my seam view was blocked by a dead tree trunk. I stopped moving and held still, The John boat's motor started again in a quick burst. The helm man backed them away from the debris field. The binocular man kept watching the bank now, not my spot. The infected moaned again and started wading toward the waterline. The men did not want to deal with that. They turned their boat and eased back down the channel, leaving the pocket unsearched. I waited until their engine sound faded completely before I moved again. That day I stayed inside and did not touch a single loose object for hours. I sat in darkness and listened to my own environment. Drip of condensation, distant birds, faint creak of wood. I replayed every step and saw the weak points. If the wind had been lower, they might have heard my chain. If the debris had been less, they might have glided closer. If I had been on deck a minute longer, they might have seen my silhouette. I tightened my rules again. No roof work unless rain is loud or wind is high. No anchor work without cloth wraps, no casual movement. Every action has to be justified. That is what the fortress really is. Not the blackout, not the tape, not the boat. It is discipline. I do not know how long I can keep doing this. That is not a cliffhanger. That is a fact. Water and weather and people will keep pushing. The infected will keep wandering. Fuel will run out eventually. Tape will fail eventually. A storm will come that forces me to run the engine longer than I want. A circling boat will get luckier than the last one. Those things are real. What is also real is what I have proven so far. I can stay unseen if I treat every day as a day where someone might be watching. I can survive if I keep moving my hiding spots and never let routine become visible from the outside. Tonight, I am anchored deep in the backwater again, behind dead trees that block the moonlight and break up my shape. My water jugs are full from a spring rain that came hard and loud. My food is low, but not empty. My fuel is lower, but I have the sculling oar and the current. My windows are blacked out tight. No seams, no glow. I have one small light wrapped in cloth that I will not turn on unless I have to. I have my bags packed, one by each exit, because boats are traps when someone boards. I have my ears trained on the channel. I do not chase comfort anymore. I chase silence. Silence is what keeps the calm water calm. In the morning, I will check the anchor line for chafe, check the tarp for tears, and check the water level against the bank marks I scratched into a piece of wood. I will fish at an odd hour, not the same as yesterday. I will wipe down every surface I touch. I will keep the boat looking dead. If a boat circles out there on the main river, he will see nothing worth stopping for. If an infected moans on the bank, it will moan at empty trees and mud. If a person calls out into the water, he will hear only birds and wind. That is how I stay alive, not by winning, not by fighting, by refusing to be found.